Planes, trains, and automobiles. We rely on them to get us to and from wherever we want to go. But when something gets a little too old or technology makes it obsolete, we'll buy something new, and we'll usually sell our old method of transport. Sometimes, though, instead of being sold, things just get lost or abandoned. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the most astonishing abandoned vehicles that have ever been found. Let's get to it. The Russian military is very good at keeping their secrets, so we'll probably never know for sure how or why this Ilyushin Il-28 aircraft came to be abandoned in a forest. We do know that it's been there for a very long time, though. The Ilyushin was one of the first mass-produced aircraft in the history of the USSR, and was in common use for commercial purposes during the 1950s and 1960s. Why this model is in a forest is unknown, but it didn't crash. It's in very good condition, so whoever flew it must have landed it and walked away. Based on the way that trees and plants are now growing through it, it's believed to have been in situ for over a decade. What's a U.S. Army Sherman tank doing on a beach in Puerto Rico? Is it on holiday? Did the driver get lost? Actually, no. It's a relic of U.S. Army training exercises decades ago. The military used to use Flamenco Beach as a simulated theater of combat for new recruits, and the tanks were used as target practice. The locals weren't too happy about having soldiers running across the beach firing weapons on a regular basis, and after years of protests, they finally left in the 1970s. They didn't tidy up after themselves before they left, though, and so the tanks were left for someone else to deal with. Rather than scrapping them, the natives decided to decorate them instead. Now they're decked out in colorful graffiti and serve as something of a tourist attraction. Major constructions out at sea require specialist building tools. For example, gigantic floating cranes. When it was built in 1987, the BOS 400 was the largest floating crane in Africa. It was actually French-owned and manufactured in Poland, but was on lease to the government of South Africa when it ran into trouble and had to be abandoned. It was being towed by a Russian tugboat in 1994 when a storm hit, and the rope towing the crane snapped. The vessel is a barge with no independent engines of its own, so without the tug to pull it, it was left to the mercy of the tides and ran aground on a beach in Maori Bay, South Africa. Despite multiple attempts to salvage the vessel and drag it back to the safety of the water, it couldn't be moved, and its owners had to declare it a total loss. Considering that it had a value of over $70 million, that must have been a difficult decision to make. All 14 crew who were on the crane at the time survived, and were airlifted to safety from the stricken crane. It's not just the Americans who can be careless with their tanks. The Russians have been known to leave them behind too. In this case, though, the abandonment isn't so much an accident as a reminder to the Japanese. These abandoned Russian IS-1 and IS-2 tanks are on the contested island of Shikoten, which both Russia and Japan claim ownership of. It was originally Russian, then given to the Japanese, only to be taken back by Russia during the events of 1939 to 1945. Japan has always wanted the islands back, but Russia has never shown any interest in giving it to them. In fact, they took the step of heavily fortifying the island just in case the Japanese ever come looking. These days, all the weaponry is abandoned, but they still make for interesting landmarks. A ride aboard the Orient Express was once considered to be the epitome of luxury and opulence. The scenic train tours were a first-class service, complete with elegant food and incredible scenery. The trains that carried these luxury travels were dressed up immaculately, and so it's a real shame to see one rotting away and forgotten. Urban explorer Brian Romaijan found this example of an Orient Express service rusting away in a train yard in Belgium, having sat there for over 50 years since it was retired from service. He managed to get inside to take some pictures, and there are still visible signs of the beauty that it once possessed. but half a century of rust has set in, and now it's falling apart. It's a priceless piece of history that should be in a museum, instead of a remote railway station where nobody cares for it. Belgium doesn't have a monopoly on abandoned and forgotten trains, though, and just one Orient Express pales in comparison to what can be found in Uyuni, Bolivia. This is an entire graveyard of trains, retired from service and left to face the cold, salty winds that blast through this high plain of the Andes. Back in the 1800s, the government of Bolivia had plans to turn Uyuni into a transport hub for the whole nation. But those plans changed after construction work and preparation had already begun, including the import of trains from Great Britain. With the trains no longer required, they'd been left to rust ever since. And without fencing or any security, they've become a popular target for vandals and graffiti artists. Now almost nothing remains but the rusty shells of the once proud vehicles. You'd like to think that the world's first ever independent submarine would be preserved somewhere and cared for. But you'd be wrong. The Submarine Explorer is a German invention, completed in 1866, and was remarkable for being able to both dive and come back to the surface without needing the support of a normal ship or boat. Unfortunately, the designers were unfamiliar with the concept of the bends, a severe form of decompression sickness that can affect deep-sea divers. It was being used as a diving ship off the coast of Panama's Pearl Island when a series of dives in quick succession caused serious illness among the crew, meaning they had to evacuate the vessel. Without anyone to man it, it sank, and wasn't rediscovered until 2001. Although 100 years of being underwater have damaged it beyond all repair, there are still periodic assessments conducted to see if there's any way of moving it safely. Builders often come across unusual lost property when they're demolishing old homes. But what David Mount found in North Carolina when preparing what should have been a straightforward home demolition really took his breath away. There were no less than 10 rare and classic cars hidden in the property's basement, and more out in the garden, buried under decades of vegetation. In among the collection is a 1933 Plymouth Roadster and a 1939 Chevrolet sedan, but some of the cars are custom builds that defy classification. Nobody knows for sure who originally owned the cars or how they came to be abandoned, but the owner of the property told David that they had no desire to keep them. That means David was able to take ownership of them himself. He sold some of them already, but intends to keep others and try to restore them. The Lopotinsky phosphate mine near Voskresensk in Russia was once a major base of industry, a very active and lucrative mine that was worked for decades from the 1930s through to the 1990s. When it was decided that the mine was no longer useful, having given up as much phosphate as it was going to give, it was abandoned. The miners didn't take their equipment with them when they left, and the result is that millions of dollars worth of advanced and specialized mining equipment is still there, exposed to the elements and forgotten. Some of these unusual vehicles are specially adapted trains, which have been purpose-built to work inside the mine, along with multi-bucket excavators. Having been left alone for so many years, many of the devices are beyond use, but in recent years there have been attempts to turn them into scrap metal. That would be a sad end for vehicles which once played such a vital role in the economy. The vehicles used by emergency services always make the best use of the technology available at the time they're created. That means that whenever new technology comes along, new vehicles are built, and the old ones are mothballed. Those mothballed vehicles have to go somewhere. And in the case of France's obsolete fire trucks, that somewhere is a strange and forgotten warehouse. Coated with dust, some of the trucks in the warehouse are over a century old. Apparently, the government arranged for them to be stored here in preparation for the opening of a museum. And there are several similar warehouses in secret locations across France. Nobody likes to see vehicles abandoned like this, but at least they're in a safe location and protected from the elements. So they remain in immaculate condition. apart from the dust. Out in the deserts of Kazakhstan, forgotten by time, the secrets of Russia's ill-fated space shuttle program are waiting for urban explorers to visit them. Huge Hangar was abandoned decades ago, but incredibly, 2 entire multi-million-dollar space shuttles are still inside, slowly rusting away. Even though they are both complete, neither of them ever left Earth after the government gave up on the project. Work on the shuttles would have been completed at some point during the 1970s or 1980s, when the Russians were still trying to compete with the Americans in space. Funding for projects such as this was canceled by former Russian President Boris Yeltsin in 1993 when the Russian economy was struggling, and nobody ever returned to them to resume work. Leaving expensive vehicles abandoned and forgotten must be something of a hobby for the Russians, because here's an entire forest full of them. During the time when the Soviet era was in full swing, Russia spared no expense on its manufacturing industry, resulting in the production of thousands of engineering vehicles like the ones seen here. When the economy contracted, they were no longer needed, and so they were taken here and left. This is just one of many such sites which can be found all over the east of Russia and Siberia. Most of the vehicles that can be found here can be traced back to the 1970s, when they worked laying cables or digging trenches. And there are also power trucks and other maintenance machines. Very slowly, the government is working through them all to use them as scrap metal, sending them across to steel mills for fusion. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.